Hey everyone, Lauren from A Girl and Her Wool here. So today is Friday, TGIF, happy Friday. Um, Fridays are the best, right? So I'm here to do a finished object post. I always do a separate video on my finished objects just to go into more detail on them and not have it take up too much time on my Wednesday whip videos. So today's finished object is my painting brick shawl. I'm sitting on it. So you can see this is a humongous shawl, and I knit this out of my hand-dyed yarn. So the gradient that you see throughout it is my neon unicorn gradient, which goes from a turquoise to a hot pink. And the main color, which is to me it's the contrast color, but the main color here is denim, which is another one of my colors, and it's a tonal denim, medium denim blue. And this thing is done. I've had quite the journey for this. So it is done. It is knit. The ends are woven in. I've blocked it. And I've trimmed off most of the ends. I just realized now there are some still hanging off, but it is done. I haven't taken photos of that yet, so that'll probably happen tomorrow on Saturday. And so if there won't be any pictures popping up throughout this video, but if you are interested, then definitely check me out on Ravelry. I'm A Girl and Her Wool there, or you can check my Instagram if I post about it there. You can also probably see photos on my blog post. So my Faux Friday blog post won't go up until Saturday until I have the photos done. But anyway, so again, I have had quite the journey with this shawl. And I will say, if you know the pattern, you will see it probably looks a little bit different, and I did make some changes to the pattern. So without further ado, here's kind of my adventure with the painting brick shawl. So first of all, I have quite a few gradients in my shop, and so I have been looking for good gradient patterns to knit up with to show kind of how you can use gradients. I know a lot of questions that I've heard are, what can I do with gradients? What are good patterns for gradients? And so I'm definitely trying to remember that and point them out when I do find them. And if you know this pattern, and if you don't know this pattern, the way it works is you have these offsetting rectangles, and that's basically how the pattern goes. And so when you knit the shawl to pattern, each row of rectangles is a unique color. And so at the end of each repeat, you break the contrast color and start a new one and do the next row with another one. And the way that he has the pattern set up, did I say that? This is a pattern by Stephen West. I have filmed this intro, or I filmed an intro to this video a few times now. The painting brick shawl is a pattern by Stephen West. And the way he has it set up is, again, each row is a different color, and so he goes through almost like a rainbow, and he just starts his color repeats over again, and then there's a chevron border. So for me to do the gradient, instead of breaking the contrast color at the end of each row, I just kept going until I used up most of each color in the gradient. And so you see it kind of progresses through those blues and then into the light pinks, and then into the brighter pinks. And so I think that's one way to do it. I think another way is you could use the gradient in the same way the pattern is written and do each row as its own color, and then progress through the gradient in the same way that he does throughout his minis. I just prefer to do one long gradient with this pattern. So what ended up happening for me is I was trying to control the colors a lot. So because the rows start out so short at the beginning and they get so long at the end, you end up with more blue rows than pink rows because the pink rows are longer. So at first I was trying to control that, and you'll see I do have a lot of The first color probably goes from like here to here, here to here, and then this is the second color. And I was trying to not use as much of those colors at first, knowing that I would want more of the pink to show in the shawl. So I got to the border and I realized I wasn't gonna have enough yarn. And it wasn't because I didn't have enough yarn, it was just I cut the blues off with so much yarn left that I wasn't gonna have enough pink at the end to get through it. Like I just didn't do the math right. And so I ended up ripping back to I think like the third blue color. Like I ended up ripping back a lot of the shawl, and I reknitted again, and I just ended up using most of each color. So what I did was I dyed up 15-gram skeins of each color, which is about 600 yards, which is how much the pattern calls for. And so I ended up using most of each color except for the two darkest blues. I still have a lot of that left. But then after that, I ended up just knitting most of it, and I figured that I could mess around with the end of it, where I could do more rows of pink if I ended up with a lot left over then. So I went back on my merry way, and again, these go quick because for the most part, you're just knitting across or purling across with some slip stitches. Like you're really just not, there's not too much that you need to think about when you're knitting this. So even though the rows are so long, the shawl did knit up pretty quickly overall. I will say that it helped to have the 10 mini skeins, because a lot of times with a shawl, you make so much progress when the rows are so short and you're like, this shawl's gonna be quick. And then you get to the point where there's super long rows and it's never ending. But because I knew, oh, I'm on the fourth color, my gradient, I'm about 40% done, that just like made it go much quicker in a way where, you know, it was like, oh, well, once I finish up this color, I'll be 50% of the way there. So let me just get through it. And then, you know, when I got to 50%, I was like, you know, I actually am 50% of the way there. Like I've used 50% of my colors. Anyway, so it did go pretty quickly from that perspective. So I did it the first time, got to the border, ripped back to the third color, knit more of it, got back to the border and started the border. So I think I was on like color 6 or 7 at the border. I can't remember exactly. And the border of this shawl has a chevron pattern. And the way that he has it set up is he restarts his color progression at the border. And so it makes for a really nice separation and clear cut of where that chevron border starts. For me, the chevron border just started like somewhere in here, somewhere in these rows. And so I didn't like how much the chevron border was blending in with the shawl. So you had like that gradient and then all of a sudden the chevron was there, and it just didn't go very well. Like there wasn't that clear cut, this is a border line. And so I ended up ripping the chevron border back out. It was also driving me crazy because like most of the shawl was like easy, don't think about it, just knit this whole row, just purl this whole row. And then you get to the chevron and their increase, it was driving me crazy anyway. So I ended up ripping my chevron border back out, and I just continued with the overall recipe of the pattern. So I just did more repeats of these rows and kind of increase the shawl as I had been throughout the whole shawl. So it's essentially a borderless crescent shaped shawl that is absolutely humongous. So that was kind of that adventure, and I did finish it again pretty quickly, I think in about a month, but knowing that I essentially have maybe knit 2 of them at this point. So it's definitely a good pattern from that perspective. I did do the I-cord bind off. So in the pattern he says you can do either an I-cord bind off or a regular bind off, and I opted for the I-cord one. I do think so if you don't know, an I-cord bind off just makes kind of a more rounded knit edge versus a regular border, and because a lot of the garter stitch is there, it just kind of blended in really well with the garter stitch, so I actually really liked it. So I did that, and again, it didn't take that long. I mean, there's approximately 60 million stitches on the last row, and it wasn't too bad, so I definitely recommend doing that I-cord bind off. The other thing too is like blocking this, I really just laid it out. With the chevron border, I would have had to block the points. And I find that when you block points, and if you have good tips for this, definitely let me know, they just never stay. Like, even with best intentions, if I pin it all out perfectly, they're just never great and pointy for that long. And while I do wash my shawls, I don't wash them that often. And so blocking out the points, just much easier to have a nice rounded crescent shaped shawl. So that is the general story of how kind of this project went for me. Again, I definitely recommend the pattern. This was my first time knitting a Stephen West pattern. I love the gradient in it, but I will say it is too big for me to wear. So that's kind of the next piece of this. So I blocked this out and held it up to myself. It is superwash yarn, so keep that in mind. And it went down to my knees. I'm 5'2", and I know Stephen West is not, and it legit went down to my knees. And you know, it's a fingering weight, it's pretty airy, so in terms of calling it like a blanket, it just wouldn't. I mean, it's comfortable, right? Like, I could lay underneath this. So I did, for the very first time, I threw this shawl in the dryer. I never do that. I hand wash my socks. I put them on the drying rack. All of my hand knits, I hand wash and I lay out. I've never put anything in the dryer. And so the fact that this took so long and was a shop sample, it's kind of funny how I was okay with doing it, but it was just so big. I was like, I gotta try this. So I put it in the dryer for like 10 minutes and nothing went wrong. It wasn't fuzzy. Nothing seemed to go wrong. It seemed just as big. So then I think I did it for another 20 minutes. And that time when it came out, it was much more dry. And it still seemed humongous. But I have tried it on now that it's completely dry and it's down to my waist, which is like more normal, I think, for some shawls. Like, I have shawls where the point definitely comes down that far. But this is just so long that when you wrap it around, I mean, it just takes up my whole body. So I don't plan on wearing this anyway because it's a sample. It'll make a great display, or it could be like a tablecloth. But if I were to knit this again to wear it, I would definitely have to go down a needle size or two, and I would definitely not do as many repeats. So I should have stuck with it the original time that I did less of all of the blues and just ended the pattern where it ended, where I ran out of yarn, or where like I chose to end each color. That being said, I did not get gauge. So I do swatch. I swatch for all of my patterns, but I don't swatch for shawls. I don't normally care. They usually come out good enough. If they come out a little bit big, I don't care. If they come out a little bit small, I don't care. This pattern has a gauge of 5 stitches per inch, and I ended up with like 4 to 4.5 stitches per inch. So this is definitely bigger than what the pattern expects it to be. But again, I don't gauge for shawls, and I don't anticipate doing that. I have knit with my own yarn before, so I knew what it should come out like. But even if you are used to doing it with the same yarn, different patterns play differently. I did also go down a needle size from what he asked for, I think. Well, I know I definitely knit this with a 4. I think the pattern called for a 5, but I'm not sure about that. But my gauge did come out wrong. My measurements are bigger than what it said, and part of that too could be the fact that I did the crescent shape versus the chevron. The chevron probably would have pulled it in a little bit, and that's fine. Again, my goal with this was to show off the gradient, and it does that, so I am happy with that. So in terms of talking about what I would do differently, I think about a week after I started this shawl, he released the rectangular painting bricks wrap. I forget what he calls it exactly, if it's just the painting bricks wrap or whatever it is, but it's a rectangular chevron pattern that is the exact same thing as this, other than it's just in the chevron and it's not a crescent shawl with a border, it's just a rectangular wrap. If I had not cast this on by then, and I was knitting pretty monogamously on this one, and so at that point I wasn't going to rip back, even though I ended up ripping back all my progress. At that point I was committed to doing the pattern I was doing, and but if I hadn't cast it on then, I would have done that rectangular wrap. And I think that if you're considering it, definitely look at that wrap, because if you want to do it as he has written and use minis that you have and cut them at the end of each repeat, I think the shawl is good. But if you want to play around like I did with this gradient and not necessarily cut each row, or if you're not sure you have enough of each mini, doing that rectangular wrap, you'll just end the color where you run out, and it's not as big of a deal. You also can make the wrap longer or shorter, and it's not as big of a deal. You don't have to worry about the longer rows, so you get less of each color like you do with the wrap. So I think for a gradient, that pattern is actually better. And that's something that I would have done differently if I wanted to rip it all out at that time. Nacho is here now. He was sitting on the floor nearby, decided, I guess, to get on camera now too. So that is really all that I think I have to say about this one shawl. For doing a Stephen West pattern, it was really nice. You know, he did have it written out pretty well, and I have to say, this is kind of not necessarily all about his style of writing. I've seen this in other designers that I really enjoyed too. You have some designers who will say, you know, kind of like follow this pattern, or, you know, they'll use the asterisk and it will be, you know, repeat this until 3 stitches before the end and then whatever. And there are some designers who write out the instructions for every single row. And while I think that that is great because they probably get less questions, it's less confusing if you're a beginner and you're not sure what to do. Sometimes it just means that you have to have your pattern out with you all the time, and instead of just saying do this repeat like X number of times, you end up having to look and see, is this the same row or did they tweak it a little bit? And then to me, it just makes it more confusing sometimes because you're like, well, they chose to write out this row separately, so maybe there's something different about it. But I don't think there is. Did I miss something? And it just slows me down. And in this pattern, he did have one thing that was like, you know, you'll repeat this throughout. But all the other rows were kind of written out individually, and it's the same idea. It's the same idea every single time. What's changing, you know, it's the same idea every single time. Like, I didn't need every single one of these rows written out. So that's kind of just like a personal preference. Again, if you like all rows written out, he did that. So there's nothing unclear about the pattern. I had no questions about it. I made no mistakes along the way. Nothing like that. So it was a good first Stephen West experience, and I'm glad I did it with some colorful colors because that's always what he likes to do. So it was good to use some bright colors in my Stephen West shawl, and I'll definitely keep an eye out on his in the future. So if you have any questions on anything I talked about, comment below and let me know. And if there's anything you want to hear more about, certainly let me know as well. I'm so excited this shawl is off the needles because it means that I get to focus on some other projects, which you can hear all about on my next video on Wednesday, which is always labeled as Knitting Projects Recap. And in the meantime, you can check me out on Instagram, agirlandherwool there. And the neon unicorn gradient and denim are both listed in my shop. I don't have kits set up for this, but if you are new to my shop, you can order your skeins in any sizes, so you can definitely order the neon unicorn gradient in 15-gram minis. The pattern called for 2 skeins of denim. I have not measured my leftovers, but I think I used 1.5, which is what he actually said you need. So you could do an 150-gram skein of one color and 15-gram minis of any of my gradients, and that will be more than enough because you will get a gigantic shawl. So you can also do the 10-gram minis if you prefer that, and have a smaller one. So yeah, if you have any questions about that, I'm more than happy to help. And I will see you soon. Bye.